the previous video, we discussed about the ADSR, which is pretty much the most basic way to design sounds. So, this time, we will be adding further spice to our sounds with effects, which, you guessed it, will be applied to the sound source. There are many basic effects that are commonly used. Some of them you might have already been familiar with. But first up in this video, we will tackle the filters, which will probably be the longest part in this course. Don't worry though, as it's really just long because of the variations. So, without further ado, let's talk filters. Filters and EQs do a simple task. They cut off frequencies, or sometimes amplify them. Think of it as an actual filter, or a strainer perhaps. By default, sounds have frequencies, and when sound is passed through a filter, the sound will now be playing with a part of its frequencies cut off or amplified. To show what I mean by frequency in a sound, here is a graphical view of a sound in an equalizer, which shows all of its available frequencies starting from the lowest to the highest. Now, watch what happens if I try to cut off a frequency or a frequency band. You can hear how the sound changes drastically, and well, if you have sensitive ears, you may probably feel the change too. Within Vito, there are two main ways you can apply filters to your sound. Firstly, of course, is just down here below the sampler oscillator. We have two filters, filter 1 on the left and 2 on the right, so toggle whichever you prefer. The second way you can apply filters in Vito is through the effects section here on the top. From here, just toggle the filter on. To ensure that the sound is actually passing through the filter, you can double check the sound that you're trying to apply a filter. Below the level and panning knobs, here on the left, you can say it says filter 1. If it does, that means it's being filtered into filter 1. And of course, pressing right or left can change it to other directories such as filter 2 or the effects. But for the most part, just stick it to either filter 1 or 2 for now. Aside from that, click on the button above where it says Analog by default. You can change the kind of filter, and we will discuss the types of filters that are commonly used on sound design. When it comes to filters, plugins can sometimes show you a lot of knobs or parameters. This is also fairly common with other effects, but all in all, within a filter, there are only two main parameters that you must take in mind. Firstly is the cutoff frequency, or sometimes called cutoff point. This parameter lets you indicate where the cutoff of the filter will be happening. The lower you set it, the more it will lean towards lower frequencies. And of course, the higher you set it, the higher it will lean towards higher frequencies. The next parameter is the resonance, or sometimes called cutoff strength. And it basically does that. This parameter lets you determine how strong you cut off or amplify a frequency. As I mentioned before, filters are usually used to cut off or amplify some frequencies, so it would be best to only use filters on sounds that has a lot of frequencies. In other words, if you try to use filters on a sine wave, for example, there won't be much of a change due to the fact that sines only have one pure frequency. So, I would highly suggest for this example to use it on sounds with more frequencies like the saw wave, or if you want, you can use recorded sounds with a sampler oscillator on Vital. You can opt to use white noise, of course, which is very nice to test out in understanding filters. Or you can simply drag any recorded sounds that you have and place it on this sampler. There are many types of filters, and each filter cuts off frequencies in a different way. Though, to not get ahead of ourselves, we will just discuss 9 of them, which are usually the most common filters that are used in most sound design. The low-pass filter, also known as a high-cut filter, is the most used one of them all. The general use of a low-pass is that it will cut off all frequencies above the cutoff point you set it to. The low pass is easily identifiable from a progressive slope pattern to the right, which pretty much indicates how much of the frequencies was cut based from the slope. As you can hear, the sound becomes somewhat quieter, and if you place the cutoff filter much lower, you can simulate an effect of the sound being played like through a wall or behind an object. That is pretty much the idea of the low pass. Before we move on to the next filter, I want to point out the number that you will sometimes see on a filter, like on this one, which states 12 dB. Now, if there is a number beside your filter, it pretty much just refers to the firmness of the slope. So, for example, this is how the slope of the filter will look like on 12, and see how firm it becomes when it gets set to 24. Some filters, either from other plugins or synths, can also come with other values like 4, 6, 8, 12. Just remember, the higher the number, the firmer the slope becomes. The high-pass filter, also known as the low-cut filter, acts pretty much the same as the low-pass filter, with the difference being that the filter cuts off below the cutoff point. The idea of a high-pass filter is the same as the low-pass, however the effect differs. Since we are now cutting the lower frequencies of a sound, we are usually cutting frequencies that sounds bassy. A high-pass filter is usually used a lot in sound editing, where it is utilized to make dialogue sound less underwatery-ish from a recording. In sound design, it's kind of the same. You could say that though bass may be good, sometimes it's not needed at all. On Vital, there isn't really an option for a high-pass filter on the button when you clicked analog. Instead, we use this other slider on top of the filter called blend. All we have to do to get a high-pass filter is to just slide it all the way to the right, and voila, you now have a high-pass filter. This filter is good for isolating a frequency or a frequency band of a sound. Especially for amplifying it with the resonance knob, you can amplify the cutoff point solely without affecting the other bands. Because it combines the effect of both the low pass and high pass, it creates a somewhat sort of telephone effect on sounds.
Think, Mark! Think, Mark! Think, Mark! Think, Mark!
On Vital, like the high pass filter, there is really no option on the type of filters for a bandpass filter. Instead, we will do exactly the same thing with the slider before, but this time, instead of sliding it all the way to the right, we will just leave it on the middle. And there you have a bandpass filter. The notch filter is like the opposite of a bandpass filter. Unlike the bandpass, the notch filter will cut off only the frequency or frequency band of the chosen cutoff point, with the resonance knob letting you widen the cutoff. As its usage suggests, this is really only utilized when you want to cut off unwanted frequencies without the needing of cutting everything else above or below the cutoff point. On its own, it is not really much. However, this type of filter is useful for getting rid parts of an echo or a reverb in some audio recordings, especially when you utilize the filter on an equalizer, but we will discuss what equalizers are in a little bit. The high shelf filter allows you to lower or raise every frequencies above the cutoff point equally. It is kind of the same as the low pass filter in a sense, but unlike the low pass, you have more control over how much of the frequencies will be lowered without it getting cut off to zero immediately. Now, some of you that is using Vital right now might probably be wondering, where is the shelf filter? Or how can you get it on the filter types? Well, unfortunately, shelf filters are not really available in most inbuilt filters in generators or synth plugin, Vital included. However, they are commonly seen in equalizers, which Vital also has one. So, instead of the filters below here, we will be needing to navigate to the effects section of Vital and turning on the equalizer. Now, you can just leave it by default and just move the circle on the right side either up or down, and voila, you have a high shelf filter type. High shelf filters are usually used to add some saturation to a sound, or well, make it sound less brazy or dissonant without the needing to cut off the high ends completely. Low shelf filters are pretty much the same as a high shelf, with it affecting frequencies below the cutoff point. You can of course lower the frequencies without needing to cut it off completely, and yes, it can also be located in the equalizer effect on Vital. The effect of the low shelf is also pretty much the same as the high shelf, albeit this time affecting the low ends instead of the highs. Comb filters, as the name suggests, have their filters shaped like a comb. Literally. Originally, I did not want to include this filter type as it rather looks menacing at first for beginners. However, understanding how comb filters work will allow us to understand another of the effects later on called the flanger. We will get there when we get there. There are two kinds of comb filters, the feed-forward comb filter and the feedback comb filter. They look rather the same when you look at it, but I assure you they are indeed different. The feed-forward comb filter is like a combination of notch filters set to the multiples of a frequency. Simply put, the second notch filter will be twice smaller than the first one, then the next 3 times, and so on and so forth, making this comb shape from notch filters. Next up is the feedback comb filter. Unlike the feed-forward, feedback comb filters utilizes multiple bandpass filters instead of notch filters, though it generally acts the same as the feed-forward in terms of its general use. Now I will say though, comb filters look really intimidating to use, but overall, comb filters are good to apply like a breathy effect on sounds. This is very evident when used on stuff like white noise or brown noise, which can make interesting sounds for like mechs or lasers. Lastly, we have equalizers, or specifically the parametric EQ. The parametric EQ is one of the most commonly used form of equalizers. Equalizers are like a combination of multiple filters. Another type of EQ is called the graphic EQ, which the difference being only is that the parametric EQ has a frequency spectrum that lets you see how the filters are actually affecting the sound frequencies when you apply filters on it. A parametric EQ allows you to add points, which are these circles that you can see. And depending on the plugin, you can have either 3 like on Vital or up to 8 on FL Studio stock parametric EQ. These points on the EQ are actually the filters themselves. If you have noticed the filters we have discussed earlier, each filter type usually comes in a form of shape, and the parametric EQ lets you do exactly that, which is to shape the filter itself to anything you want, and combine multiple filter types if you so prefer. Now you are probably wondering what is this point peaking on the example I gave you. Now, point peaking, or sometimes just called peaking, just refers to a default parameter that you amplify. You could say that it's a bandpass filter, but generally it's referred to as point peaking for the most part, since it does not cut off low or high ends. As you can expect, EQs can really bring a variation to your sounds with its array of filters. Now it can be daunting to use EQs at first, but as a rule of thumb, always remember, lower frequencies much more rather than boosting them. This means that if you ever want to fiddle with EQs, it would be best to cut or lessen frequencies much more than amplifying them, or else you may end up with a very oversaturated sound, unless of course if that's what you're aiming for. That will be all for the different filter types that's commonly used in sound design. Try it out on different sounds, especially with recorded sounds. As shown earlier, you can use Vital Sampler to make sounds from a recording be played on a synth. Apply different filters on them and see how different sounds differ from each filter types.